We're here again with our esteemed, I should say, career, former US Army Brigadier General, now retired, John Adams, primarily because we have the renewal of fighting, along with a host of revelations and about misuse of intelligence. That's the only word I can use for it. And also the domestic Israeli implications of that as well, in terms of the stability of the current war cabinet and coalition. So let's start at the beginning, General. What's behind Hamas's renewal of fighting with Israel after the release of more than 80 Israeli, Thai, and Russian Israeli hostages? And I might note, amongst the group of unreleased hostages are a couple of Americans, as I recall. So what's up?
Well, first of all, I have to say to you, thank you very much for the opportunity today. And we both, and so many Americans and our fellow Jews, keep our minds on the people of Israel. We're actually mindful always of the suffering that was caused on October 7th and the need to destroy Hamas completely and to bring the hostages home. So I say that all that with a prayer for the Jewish people, for Israel, the state of Israel, and for the IDF. This pause ended specifically because Hamas broke the agreement.
Right.
They are responsible. They're responsible for all of this. I think we have to have that in mind here. The suffering is Hamas' responsibility. It's not the IDF. It's not Israel. It's not the government of Israel. It's Hamas that has done this whole thing. But specifically the pause stopped because even as there were negotiations taking place in good faith in Qatar, Hamas decided to stop this because they wanted to shoot rockets at Israel. And they also refused to release women, which was part of the agreement. So the government of Israel, negotiating through intermediaries in Qatar, in the original agreement, the intent was to have families released, to have women and children released, and Hamas reneged on that. At one point, they said, we'll give you dead bodies, which would be a blessing for those who had their family members killed. But that was not the agreement. The agreement was to give priority to women and children and families. So, you know, it might, a possible reason that this broke down. I have to also say 3 days ago or 2 days ago, there was a massacre in Jerusalem at a bus stop where 3 people died. And that was Hamas too. And that was that was during the negotiations, and Hamas claimed credit for it. So there's no doubt that they were the ones responsible. But Hamas is just a devilish negotiating partner. They're going to do everything they can to make this whole process hard. They have no interest in helping human beings. There's no humanitarian purpose in what they do at all. And the example that we can see is that when they broke the agreement, the pause in fighting, they did it. They launched rockets at Israel, and they committed murder in the middle of Jerusalem. So
one of those victims happened to be a pregnant mother with child, which made it terrible in terms of the loss. But you are absolutely correct. This was an extension of Hamas's arm in Jerusalem proper, not the West Bank, but Jerusalem proper, that perpetrated this heinous crime. How many American civilians and IDF POWs remain under Hamas PIJ or so-called independent Gaza clan control at this point?
And that bears on the previous question too, because there is Hamas, and we have no doubt that Hamas is a hierarchical organization, but then there's the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and tribe organizations or clan groups. who are probably rather loosely controlled by Hamas. So when you have firing going on of rockets from Gaza, they may or may not be at the direction of Hamas leadership, but Hamas is responsible for it. But back to your question, current reports indicate that there are about 10 Americans still in Hamas custody as hostages. About 10. We don't know for sure. And there's different organizations from the Israeli government to news organizations report about 10. And that they've had approximately, the latest figure on the number of hostages from the Israeli government was, I think, yesterday, 136.
Right.
I don't see any hard figure on how many of the remaining 136 are Israeli soldiers, either males or females. I just don't see any figure. One can imagine, since they overran at least part of the Gaza division headquarters, and I'm sure they took a share of hostages, there are a fair number of the 136 remaining who are soldiers, either men or women, IDF soldiers. The best estimate is that there are 119 men as hostages and 117 women and children still remaining, and about 10 Americans. So that's what the numbers look like right now.
So on the eve of the renewal, there comes U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken back to Jerusalem, and he's trying to minimize civilian casualties and while trying to support Israel's objective. And so the question is, what was Bibi's war cabinet response?
The war cabinet response is that Israel will continue to operate according to international law, and that it will destroy Hamas, and they'll find them anywhere they can, and they will destroy them. And this has been a consistent message of the war cabinet: Netanyahu, Gallant, Halevi, the chief of the general staff, and Gantz, who's in the war cabinet, thank goodness, have all said similar or the same expressions. Israel will always operate under international law, and they will continue to prosecute the war to destroy Hamas. I think that the Biden administration is, to a certain extent, they're just posing, because they want to portray themselves as, we're going to make sure that the Israelis behave. We're going to tell them how to fight. We're going to not let them do anything unreasonable or not humanitarian. Well, we have an American Marine general officer in Israel who presumably is on the ground and can report to us, and perhaps shouldn't report to the international press, can report to us what he sees. So we know how they're fighting. We've been watching them for almost 2 months now. And this Marine general has experience. He fought in Fallujah during the Iraq War. He knows what he's talking about, and he knows what he's listening to. I think a lot of this posing by American diplomats, and I have respect for American diplomats. I've worked with American diplomats, and many of them are competent and accurate reporters, but they don't know war. And I think we should pay attention to our Marine general on site, who's supposed to be giving reports. I also have a high degree of confidence in the training and the ethics of the IDF. They're fighting this war as carefully as they can. They don't want to kill civilians. Killing civilians gets in their way as war fighters. What they want to do is have a war where they can accomplish their objectives with a minimum of civilian casualties, with a minimum of their own casualties. The force that's killing civilians, and it's because they want to kill civilians, is Hamas. So, great question. What did Blinken expect Netanyahu to do? He's already fighting a difficult war. His troops are fighting a difficult war. He knows how they fight because he himself is a soldier. We can depend on Israel fighting ethical combat where they try to avoid killing civilians. And they do the best they can to avoid unnecessary damage. Has there been a lot of damage? Yes, it's a brutal war. They have to accomplish their objectives. And they are accomplishing their objectives. But I think for the Biden administration to go in to see, this is like the fourth trip, I think, for Blinken since this started. And the message has been consistent. Oh, behave yourselves. They're doing the best they can. I think we should stay out of their way, personally.
There's a problem, a serious problem that Israel had this past week, just on the cusp of the renewal of fighting. You had major media, New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and the significant publications in Israel revealing that the IDF intelligence knew about the Hamas war plan over 2 years ago. And yet the information from that war plan was, what was the street expression? Poo-pooed by senior commanders in what was the Military Intelligence Directorate. So what were the findings of the report?
The report found that Hamas had created a plan more than 2 years ago. They'd been talking about this plan in different forms as it's developed since 2014 for a large-scale invasion of the border area with Gaza, where they would do everything from raiding towns and villages to overrunning IDF installations to occupying if they could. And so they've been talking about this. There's been chatter on Unit 8200, their SIGINT unit, has been picking up a lot of information about this. And I think there's been a fair amount of intelligence about the Hamas plans. Of course they would think about doing those things, but the specifics of when doesn't appear to have been something that they had that the IDF had information on. The problem, so it's been reported, and they had this plan from about 2 years ago, and it was reported to the Military Intelligence Directorate by analysts. And the Military Intelligence Directorate, to their eternal discredit, said, it's too ambitious for Hamas. They can't do it. And that was an agreed position of the chief of the Military Intelligence Directorate and those around him. So, it's hard to know, and we don't know. We do not know whether any of that information was reported up the chain to hires. It may have been. One would hope that it would be, but we don't know that. And there will be an investigation. We do know that after the war's over. But one of the things we know about the chief of the Military Intelligence Directorate, Aharon Halevi, I think it's pronounced Halavi.
Yes, it is.
Aharon Halavi, is that his family, his wife and his children were involved, significantly involved in the judicial reform protests. They don't like the current government. They don't like Netanyahu. And they're putting on these protests at the same time as Halavi Père, Senior, is actually in the chief of the Military Intelligence Directorate. Now, I don't know what, maybe his wife doesn't talk to her husband. I don't think that's very likely, but there's really a conflict of interest there. So 2 days after the October 7th event, Halavi said, I take responsibility for this disaster. That's good, but he didn't resign until last week. And he also said immediately after Netanyahu made a statement to the effect that this is an existential war for Israel. And this was in the immediate days after October 7th. He referred to it as an existential war. Halavi made a statement in an IDF forum stating that this is not an existential war. Existential war, you have to fight, and it's your nation at stake. And he said, no, it's not. Well, he's in theory supposed to be backing up the commander in chief, so to speak. That undercuts him. I think there's enough reason to think that Halavi is compromised by his political thoughts on Netanyahu, and may have been a reason why he put little credence into the fact that Hamas was planning this large-scale event. There's one of the things that he's also quoted as saying, and this is all information, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was in the Jerusalem Post, an article written by Carolyn Glick, who's a well-known scholar on the issue and reporter, journalist on the issues. She reported him that he also said, well, Hamas is actually, the fact that we're fighting Hamas is distracting from our political situation. Well, I think the opposite's true. The political situation is distracting from fighting Hamas. And, we'll see what the investigation comes out with. But one of the things Carolyn Glick argued was that we should wait until after the war's over to conduct an investigation. But Aharon Halavi needs to go now. And fortunately, he resigned last week.
That being said, Halavi may have been one of the leaders of the IDF who earlier on said that the biggest threat to Israel is not Hamas, but judicial reform.
Yeah, he did say that.
Yeah, and basically, that is a prima facie answer that indicates that he did indeed not only have a conflict of interest, but he was perpetuating myopia for the Israeli public, fostering essentially the continuing weekly protests that grew to hundreds of thousands of people across the country, mainly inspired by folks on the left, to be quite honest about it. So that's almost verges on being treasonous as far as a lot of us in the West are concerned. One of the aspects of the brutal October 7th attack was a group that you mentioned earlier, and that's the Gaza Division, which also had a Unit 8200 component, as it turned out. Are any of those individuals who were captured by Hamas from the Gaza Division essentially 8200 operatives?
It would, I don't know, and I suspect that that's privileged information that I don't have, but I suspect that if they had I'm sure that 8200 was part of
Right.
the Gaza Division, and probably some of them were captured too, because the headquarters was overrun. In fact, it was just reported today, as you know,
Yep.
that one of the senior commanders of the Gaza Division was killed on October 7th and hadn't been reported until today. But
Correct.
It's unlikely that the Unit 8200 is such an integral part of IDF structure, and they do in fact assign troops down from 8200 to subordinate units to support them. It would be hard to imagine that 8200 was not both involved in October 7th, but also probably they're either killed or captured. But we don't know that. And because it's a very sensitive operation and a very sensitive unit, it's not likely we're going to find that out anytime soon.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned something that occurred after the Yom Kippur War, which had its 50th anniversary in October this year, and that was the Agranat Commission, which really tore into the nature of IDF leadership. Some of it, as we both know, unfairly, but some not. But this likely post-conflict commission that might be set up to investigate the intelligence debacle may have a significant job to do to develop the integrity of the entire military intelligence directorate command structure. and communications, particularly if you're engaged now with a war cabinet of the type that Bibi is leading. So the question I guess I can pose to you is, what do you think is going to be different about what I call Agranat 2 as regards this current conflict than was the previous exercise?
I think it'll be more similar than different, because there's going to be such a demand within Israel for accountability about such an incredible failure of intelligence and, frankly, operations too, prior to October 7th. And one of the things that characterized the Agranat Commission, which was named for the head of the commission, it was a 5-person commission of highly respected jurists and former chiefs of staff of the IDF. It was done very quickly. The commission, within a month of the end of the Yom Kippur War in October, and in late November, they actually chaired the commission, and the results were pretty quick too. So it wasn't until April the next year when they announced the interim results and immediate impact of the results. Now, we don't know what's going to happen with Agranat 2 or whatever it's going to be called, but we do know that there's going to be an incredible pressure for convening a commission very quickly and getting some results. The Agranat 2 results were the chief of staff was relieved. The commander of Southern Command was relieved. There were a number of others. The chief of intelligence, Zairo, was relieved. 9 days after the interim results were published in April, the Prime Minister, Golda Meir, stepped down. I mean, so the results of the first Agranat Commission were massive and fairly quick. I predict what will happen, and I've already made some comments about Israeli politics, and I feel difficult to do that because I'm an American and not Israeli. I love Israel. I care about my friends. I care about Israel as a country. I care about the Jewish people. So I'm hesitant to speak about Israeli internal politics because I'm American. However, I think we share, and if we share something so precious as the survival of Israel and the health of the Israeli people, I think we should say the truth. We should say what we think. So I'm going to continue to talk about it a little bit. I think what's going to happen is that Netanyahu will have to step down. I think that's not unreasonable to expect that no matter what. He was the one in charge. He may not have known about the plan. He may not. It's possible. I think I would find that highly unlikely. He never heard anything about it. But I think he will take responsibility as a leader, and I think he will step down. I don't know who will replace him. I think some members of the war cabinet are looking pretty strong right now, along with him, and I think he is too. I'm glad Israel has such a strong leader and a soldier as Netanyahu right now during the war. But I think after the war, I don't think he'll be there anymore. And I think the commission will probably find him at least culpable because he was in charge. Fortunately, the Halavi is gone. I'm sure he'll be found culpable too, because he is. And some of his subordinates will probably be found culpable. But I think there will be first a demand to do an investigation will come quickly, and they probably do some sort of Agranat 2 commission. And then the demand for accountability will be overwhelming. And I think it'll pretty much lay out the intelligence and security leadership, because they're on duty. It's their responsibility, and I think that's what the commission is probably going to come up with. That's how I think they're very responsible in the way they hold responsibility. There's one result of the first Agranat Commission that people had a hard time explaining. Moshe Dayan, who was the defense minister, he sailed. He didn't get hit at all. I know from reading his memoirs that he felt some sense of responsibility, but he didn't take any responsibility, and he wasn't held accountable. And he
Well,
went on to serve as the foreign minister in the late 80s.
true, but Diane also panicked in that
Oh,
episode.
yeah.
And in fact, they were seriously considering using the so-called temple weapons against Syria and Egypt in particular. And fortunately, good sense intervened in that regard.
I can't imagine they let him go. I mean, he was very responsible for what happened in the Yom Kippur War,
Right.
and he made it very difficult for the mobilization, and it almost cost him the war, especially in the Golan.
It's interesting that the intelligence source was Gamal Abdel Nasser's son-in-law,
Yeah, yeah,
who was given the
the angel.
sovereign by Mossad as the angel.
Yeah,
And there's a wonderful documentary on him and his role in that episode, including the desperate act on the day of the invasion of reaching out to Zamir, the intelligence head at that point in time, and saying, hey, you know, this thing is going to happen and you better do something about it reasonably quickly. But it's another case of not responding to credible intelligence. I mean, you and I have gone through what we call sand table exercises dealing
yes,
with the question of various historic actions out there. And it was, for me, as a former military intelligence officer, one of the most instructive episodes of our training. And I have to believe that the same thing is done inside Israel proper.
yeah. I believe they do. I have no doubt that they do. It's just they're a very advanced country with the high technology and training that you would expect. So, did they know? Did they know the large structure of the military and intelligence structure? They knew. It didn't get reported correctly. And when it was reported, they assessed that it was too ambitious for Hamas.
Except for something interesting. We saw this within days after the October 7th episode. And that were films released of Hamas training at what looked to be reproductions, if you will, of Israeli kibbutzim and the fence structure. And basically, and it was not hidden. It was stuff that was out there as promotional video, essentially, for its own consumption and international consumption in the Muslim world, Muslim Brotherhood world, I might add. But I want
to, and you remember that we had indications of 9/11 that we didn't.
Oh, yes, same deal.
And I think our intelligence system is pretty good, but it's not about the technological capability. It's about whether the humans that are in the loop are making the right decisions. And
well, there was a cross up between the CIA and the FBI, as I recall. There was a dust up in that regard. And
yeah,
it looked like the CIA was pretty lame and not providing the intelligence that the FBI was picking up from its investigations, for example, of the bombing of the ship in Aden.
yeah. And our 9/11 commission picked up most of that.
Yeah.
And I think the Israelis' October 7th commission, or whatever they're going to call it, will also be they will dive deep into what exactly happened and how they can keep it from happening again.
Yep. Well, it's interesting we're talking about this because one of the announcements by Netanyahu as part of his prosecution of this war with our friends or infamous enemy Hamas is a global assassination campaign. I think after what we were just talking about, the Munich PLO attack, when Golda Meir, together with other people in Sayeret Matkal and Mossad, were told, you have authorization, go out and kill the perpetrators of this thing. It was called Operation Grapes of Wrath. I don't think that was announced. I think that was all in camera. That was
right.
Right.
That's my recollection too.
And the question is, why? Obviously, that is something that a number of us have thought about might be in the works, but why announce it ahead of time? There's also, as we were just discussing it before this program, some instances of what you and I call blowback from certain assassinations undertaken by either Mossad and or Sayeret Matkal and Shin Bet echelons. And while in the case of Hamas, you had Mr. Mashal, who was in Jordan in, I think it was 1997. It's the first year that Bibi held effective office, first term. And there were two Mossad agents with Canadian passports in Amman trying to poison, essentially, Marshall. It was found out. And of course, the then King of Jordan demanded something, and you had blowback on Israel, and Bibi was embarrassed, and he had to provide an antidote for that episode. That Marshall is very much alive and well, and one of the trio of billionaires sitting inside Qatar at this point in time, doing this stuff. But then, as I recall, there was an episode in 2010 in Dubai, which was kind of interesting. We were talking about that. What's your take on that?
Well, again, blowback. The operation succeeded. They did assassinate this operative, but unfortunately, there were cameras in the hotel room that picked up the faux tennis pros that were hanging out with him, and so they knew who they knew who they were, and that became the undoing of the operation. Or no, it wasn't undone. They killed. They did the killing, but they unfortunately compromised the assassins. Well, yes, it may be better to have not. I think there's probably a lot of reasons why the prime minister may have. In fact, the quote was, "I have instructed Mossad to act across the heads to attack the heads of Hamas wherever they are." And the defense minister, Gallant, said, "Hamas leaders are living on borrowed time." One reason that he may have decided to say that is because there's such a demand within the state of Israel for the leadership to take this seriously, and they realize that the leaders of Hamas are in Qatar and other places, in Lebanon, and hanging out in nice digs, while the subordinate commanders are in Gaza. But I think they wanted to sound strong, and I think it sounds strong. And I believe them. I think there was an announcement last week that no assassinations would take place in Qatar. Mossad was going to kill anybody in Qatar. Well, they don't have to do it in Qatar. These people travel, just like we did Soleimani when he traveled to Baghdad. There's a good reason to kill these people, even if they're only operating and they'll be replaced by other people. It's one, it's justice. And two, it's the right thing to do to disrupt their strategic leadership. So I think they'll follow up on that. I don't know when they'll do it, and hopefully they won't tell anybody, because that would mean it was not going to happen. But I think Israel is a country that respects justice, and they're also a country that operates on a strategic level. They will kill the leadership of Hamas. First, they're going to kill them in Gaza, as they should, but a lot of the senior leadership are not there, so they're going to have to do it somewhere else.
Well, speaking about the nature of the status and evaluation of war, there was a pretty interesting assessment by the former NATO Supreme Military Commander, Admiral US Navy retired, obviously, Jim Astrides, whose conclusion is that up to this time, Hamas seems to have won a major victory in the current war with Israel. And he bases that assumption on more than just his own experience in Libya in 2011 and prior to that, U.S. experience during the so-called bombing pauses that occurred in Vietnam in '73, and the run-up essentially to getting some sort of an agreement to get out of there. And then obviously his understanding, which is pretty sophisticated, about the dynamics inside this current war between Israel and Hamas. What's your assessment?
Well, I think it seemed to me that his article, I read it in Bloomberg, I think.
Yeah.
His article was written before the pause for the hostage exchange. And so I think, and I think it was very effective, and he's right, because what Hamas gained from those days was they had a chance to rearm, refit, relocate, including probably the hostages. They probably moved them around. So if there's any hint of, because they released some of them, so perhaps some of them knew something about where they were being held. So they gained, that was an advantage for Hamas. I think it was a very difficult decision for Israel to make, to accept the negotiations and the pause, and I wouldn't presume to second guess them on that. But I think we have to be clear-headed about advantages that Hamas got from a pause. I mean, the most important advantage I think they got, frankly, was they upset the pace of the attack, of the IDF attack. And especially in military operations, it's really important to keep the momentum of an attack. And even though I think they probably took advantage, IDF probably took good advantage of the time by maintaining their equipment, giving their troops a break, conducting continuous reconnaissance, aerial, human intelligence. I'm sure they continued to look at tunnels that were under their control and do whatever they needed to do to make those useless to Hamas. So I think they took advantage of the time, but they would have preferred to continue to attack just because of the momentum of the attack, and they know what they're doing. But I think Admiral was correct, and it's interesting. He referred to experiences in Vietnam and in Libya when he was the Supreme Allied Commander in Libya. I have to reflect in my own mind, just because the question has been discussed, how did we conduct our operations in a humanitarian way? We bombed them to Stone Age. There was a phrase that was often used by our commanders. We're going to bomb them into the Stone Age. And we did. And we were just bombing them. We didn't try to set up boundaries for humanitarian relief. We were trying to destroy Vietnam, and it didn't work. But we should ask ourselves that question in retrospect. How have we fought wars? When we talk about lack of civilian casualties and how to protect civilians, look at what we've done. Have we learned from that? And then send our best generals and officers, and let them watch what the IDF's doing. We would learn from them.
One example of that is the infamous Battle of Hue in 1968.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, you were in the Army then, I think, and I mean, you were watching it from an intelligence officer standpoint,
right?
And probably asking yourself some of these same questions. What are we doing? Is it worth it? Is it something that's going to produce an outcome that we want? And I don't have the answer to that. I'm not going to second guess the IDF. I'm not going to second guess Admiral Stavridis. I'm not going to second guess the commanders at the siege of Hue. It's over. But I think what we should do is approach this with a sense of humility as well as humanity. And don't make it harder for the IDF to do what they're doing. They're doing great, and we should support them, not roll logs at them as they're trying to climb a real difficult stairway.
Correct. One aspect of the war in Hamas is that a dispute over the reporting of casualty figures. And there was a recent Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs war briefing that simply said that Hamas is running a scam on these casualty figures.
Well, I guess as an observer or somebody who studies this as hard as I can to try to learn as much as I can about it, it's actually very easy to just dismiss that question saying, would you believe Hamas? I mean, every number that they report is from their own sources,
right.
And they have an agenda, which is to try to overestimate the number of casualties. But let's take a couple of examples and drill down into their reporting, which I think gives a feeling, a sense of why this is so unreliable. They're reporting 30,000, I think, no, 13,000 deaths. The number spiked from one day to the next by 3,000. That's not credible. They report the initial report of the hospital, Alia Hospital, was that it was an Israeli attack that caused, if I recall, 3,000 deaths. No, wasn't anywhere close to that. And it was, but it was the press, the Western press picked that up and ran with it, and it was reported widely, including in the New York Times. Doesn't make any sense. The hospital was attacked not by the IDF. It was attacked by a errant rocket that was fired, and the casualty numbers were, I think really the original was 5,000, but I think maybe 500.
No, it was actually less than that. And I recall writing a piece about that for the NAR because I happen to have written about the US evaluator of bomb damage that goes way back when to his career, essentially for Human Rights Watch. Previous episode, it's called the Gaza Beach episode in 2010, as I recall. So I took him apart because of essentially the lack of credibility professionally of being able to make an assessment. And I'm talking about the science of BDA. And this was his forte. So
he knows jack about BDA.
Correct. So
I know a little bit about BDA from my own military career. I did BDA for the entire Kuwaiti Theater of Operations in 1991.
Right.
And I came up, my predictions on when we should go into Iraq were pretty much, that's why I wasn't the one telling Schwarzkopf what to do, but our statistics were, he based his decisions on when to invade based on that. BDA is not, you're right, it's a science. Human Rights Watch has no training in BDA. They don't know what they're doing. And if they'd come to me back then and said, "Hey, I've got some suggestions for you," I would have given them a cup of coffee and a donut, and so sit in here and you do what you do. But it's not BDA's. The bottom line on, and I think we agree, the bottom line, there's zero reliability on what the Gaza Ministry of Health reports. Has not been, will not be. So we should just disregard their reports. I don't know where we get more accurate numbers, but I guess I would ask the IDF to do an estimate, and I would trust them.
Okay. Our friend, former Israeli Prime Minister and former Maglan Special Forces Commando, Naftali Bennett, was in a recent CNN interview calling for denazification of Hamas in Gaza. What was he referring to, and what updates did he have on the war strategy?
Well, first of all, I thought he was eloquent and very down to earth. May he continue to serve the government of Israel in some capacity, and I suspect he will. Naftali Bennett, as you said, is a veteran of combat. In one of the Israeli special units called Maglan. The specialty of Maglan, about which we know very little. We do know this: they specialize in going behind the lines with high technology equipment to disrupt what's going on. And so he understands the warfighting process very well. Plus, he was the prime minister of Israel for a year, from 21 to 22. So he knows he's been in this leadership position. So this is what he said about denazification. And he was pressed by a CNN reporter on this issue, which surprised me because I thought the CNN reporter was unnecessary. Well, he was not being a good reporter. He was being biased, as if Bennett didn't know what he was talking about. He used the denazification process for a reason, because after World War II, when the United States and the Allied powers went into Germany, they not only had to defeat the military of Nazi Germany, but the entire population was brainwashed, and they hated Jews in particular, but they hated a lot of people, and they were homicidal maniacs. They had been brought up for the previous 12 or 14 years to hate people. And so it's not just a matter of getting rid of the military leadership. You really have to make sure that people in that sort of a brainwashed environment don't say things that incite hatred against other people, and don't do things that incite hatred. So that's what denazification was. It was a countrywide process that needed to happen to get a Germany that was not educated to actually hate people. And that's what Bennett's talking about. What has been going on in Gaza for the last couple of decades has been indoctrination of young people, but everybody. But as we know, it's a 50% of the population is under 25. Indoctrination of young people to hate Jews, not just Israelis, Jews. And they have to, I think the world, but I'm sure that Israel will take the lead, as they do, on, because it's next to their country, and they're really concerned. They'll take the lead on this. So I thought this term denazification is right. The Gazans have been trained to hate, and they need to figure out how to untrain that. So Bennett said this, and I think the term, or the time period we're looking at, is about 5 years of some sort of complete control. But he wants to set up a buffer zone on the outside of Gaza. He used the term, I actually think he talked about it being 1.5 miles. I think he used English term or American terms for it, but about 1.5 miles, and that's a pretty large area that will be completely demilitarized and completely under the security control of Israel. And not that they're not going to be in control of the rest of Gaza, to make sure that there's no hatred going on inside Gaza. But for 5 years, it'll be overseen by the IDF and the government of Israel. And that's important to rid the people of this hateful ideology that they have. The other thing he said was that, he mentioned it's important to remove hatred from public discourse. That's what needs to happen. And one of the protests of the interviewer, the CNN interviewer, was, "Are you talking about restricting free speech?" And I thought Bennett handled that very well. He goes, it's not a free speech issue. This is an issue where the words that you use and the things that you do actually cause harm to other people. So it's not a free speech issue. And the IDF doesn't want to occupy Gaza. Israelis do not want to occupy Gaza. They prefer to not do it at all. They wish this never happened, but they can't let it happen again. And you've got to eliminate hatred from the education of the people and from public discourse.
And I might add, UN institutions have not penetrated that and prevented it with funds that are been provided for the education of children in Gaza, period.
You're absolutely right. And the UN Relief Works Organization is an organization that needs to be just taken off the books. They're thoroughly corrupted. So we give the mission to do this denazification to UNRWA, UN Relief Works Agency, it would be a waste of time. What's there? They weren't going to do that.
The Wall Street Journal was looking at another story that was kind of interesting to those of us who were old enough to experience it, but it gave rise to the question of evacuation of Hamas fighters and families from Gaza to an alternate location. And the model for it is what happened when the Israeli forces in the first Lebanon War, 1982, completely surrounded the PLO leadership and Yasser Arafat and the fighters in West Beirut. And they were shipped out literally to Tunisia, to Tunis. And it's from there that Yasser Arafat ultimately succeeded, I guess, because of the Oslo Accord, of being invited back, if you will. This despite the fact that the IDF undertook some spectacular attacks even in Tunis to wipe out the number two to Yasser Arafat in front of his own family back in 1988. So the question is, how realistic is that to essentially force Hamas to evacuate, since its ultimate leadership is in Qatar? And frankly, what countries, whether it's in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world, would accept them? Obviously, one country that might be a candidate for it would probably view it as an anathema, and that's Egypt. And I think there was some discussion about that. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that Qatar might be the country that is the most willing to be part of that discussion. And we saw that in the press just last week.
Yep.
So the fact that that's out there means that people are talking about it. Don't know how serious, but they're talking about it. So maybe that's an option, at least for the leadership. I can't imagine Qatar would take large numbers, but they, on the order of several thousand, that might work. Qatar, and I've spent some time in Qatar. There's not much there. There's Doha, and then there's Al Udeid, our big air base out about 75 miles away.
Right.
And the drive from Doha to Al Udeid is pretty barren. There's a lot of space, is what I'm trying to say. So that might work. I would say whatever gets the leadership out and some of the major leaders, the fighters, that would be great. I think Israel is going to do a pretty good job of killing the ones who remain in Gaza. But yeah, in terms of the population, that's a tougher nut to crack. And I don't know how serious the discussions are, but it came out today. It came out today in the press release from. We sent Vice President Harris to discuss something with President al-Sisi of Egypt, and the result was a statement that the U.S. is never going to tolerate moving the people of Palestine or from Gaza to Egypt. The subject came up. That's what that tells me. Not that there was this categorical statement, we, the U.S., will never allow that. It came up. So I know there's discussion about it. And it's not a crazy idea. Egypt is another country that has a lot of space, and a large 80 million population. And I'm not suggesting this because who the heck am I? But I've thought about it just a little bit. Egypt has got a terrible economy. They need money, and they need infrastructure. They don't have very good infrastructure. If the United States and the Western world really wanted to help Israel and really have their back, it shouldn't be to send Vice President Harris there to get a statement that there's no way we would consider it. I don't think that's the result that anybody wanted, but it's out there. So I don't know if it's you know, I think it's worth looking at in terms of feasibility. Seriously, probably not to send the vice president back to negotiate it, because I don't think that results in anything. But Al-Sisi is a practical guy. I've never met him, but I've met a lot of people around him. They're practical. That we may not like everything that they do, but they care about their country and they care about their power, and they realize.
And they also care about eliminating their version of Hamas, which is the Muslim Brotherhood.
Oh yeah, they're very active in repressing the Muslim Brotherhood. Exactly. But I think it's really not a crazy idea. And I think if we had a serious discussion with Al-Sisi and his people, we might come a lot closer than we did with this apparently casual discussion over tea and with Vice President Harris. I don't think that resulted in very much.
I think there was a proposal either by former IDF officers who were part of what is called COGAT, the group that administers so-called acquired territories. That's a euphemism. Yeah. And they had talked about an extension of the Gaza enclave from purchase of territory inside Egypt. But I think the problem there is the community, nearest Egyptian community is El Arish, and that's not terribly far away, as I recall.
You're right.
From the Rafah.
Maybe 30 miles.
That's correct. But nevertheless, they've been talking about that for a couple of years. And so this statement from Kamala Harris is sort of indicative that there have been discussions about that. But because Al-Sisi and his commanders understand only too well that Hamas is nothing more than Muslim Brotherhood with guns and an animus.
Well, I agree with you. I think I agree with everything you say. I think that one thing that might make it more attractive for them is this. I mean, there is a lot of space in Sinai,
right?
And they have a very good security apparatus in Egypt. I mean, they're focused on Muslim Brotherhood, so they wouldn't like it, but you know. I'm just thinking out of the top, really out of the box here, but Gaza is not going to be a very wealthy place for the foreseeable future. It's bombed. There's not a lot of infrastructure left. So wherever the people of Gaza live, it's going to have to require a lot of rebuilding, which is exactly what Egypt wants, is help with infrastructure, and they want money. And so I think any discussion about this option is going to be below the surface because it's so sensitive. But that's what back channels are for. I don't know if our current government has the ability to do that kind of finesse. I just don't. I don't have a lot of confidence in, let's say, the vice president. But I do think, though, that there are people. Americans who care about the United States and care about peace and care about Israel, who have the wherewithal, both from a security standpoint and a diplomatic standpoint, to at least make that opportunity more attractive for the Egyptians, if we want to. And I think we ought to turn our minds to that. I hope that there are. It's hard to know what's going to happen in the United States in the next year. Will this war continue? Yeah, probably. So let's keep our eyes open and hope for the best. Let's work towards that goal.
Final question. Why is Israel's messaging of its conduct in the current war with Hamas and Gaza fail to counter the spike in anti-Semitic hatred, both in the U.S. and globally?
You probably are very familiar with a book by Dennis Prager, and he he wrote it with a rabbi friend of his. I forget his name, but Dennis Prager's a brilliant man, and he wrote the book "Why the Jews." And the essential question that he asks in "Why the Jews" is what? Why the Jews? Why is there anti-Semitism? What is going on? And it's a pretty detailed book, and it's a very good explanation from many different angles. But I think as I read the book, and I just reviewed it again today because I love the book, but I think that I knew you would ask me this question somehow. But I think that both the question of the answer to the question, why is this happening? Why is anti-Semitism so obvious to us? And what's the answer? Are almost the same thing. Ethical monotheism, which is what causes non-Jews to resent and to hate Jews. Why? Because they're actually living lives that are focused on serving God and doing good in the world. It sounds trite, but it's true. And I know that. I do know that. And I believe that. And I'm committed to that as a human being, but I also think it's an observation on what's going on. First of all, the press is just biased, and they're trying to sell copy and make money and take advantage of it. So they're harnessing the hatred that's already in the human population, and stoking anti-Semitism is probably one of the easiest things to do in propaganda. And we've seen it over and over and over again for 4,000 years. And the 20th century just happened to be a big spike, but it's always been there. And this is anti-Semitism. We're realizing, and some of us are, I'm becoming more aware of it, is what I will say. I'm becoming more aware of it, but I'm convinced that that's true. So first, biased media, hostility to Israel is built in our media, and it's built in the media in Israel too. That really is. And I see that. I read the Jerusalem Post. I read Yediot Ahronoth, and I read the other publications, and there's always this sense of, oh, it's Israel. Let's just beat up on them. Why? Because it's anti-Semitism, and it can be Jewish anti-Semitism as well, as we know. But the other thing that is, any country that's being beat up on in the media or in public life inspires bullies to pile on. And that's why this is going on. It's people's most people have this bully motive that's just under the surface, and that's what's going on now. So why has Israel been unsuccessful? Because they're good. They worship God, and they try to do good things in the world. Maimonides said, if something's true, it's no more true because everybody agrees with it. And it's no less true for what he says it's a lie. It's truth. Israel tells the truth. It is behaving on an honorable way, in a way that anybody who believes in God and thinks that there's a good and a bad in this world would say they're on the side of good and right. But I don't think that's what the press doesn't care about that. They just want to sell papers and money. I hope that's a good answer.
I think it's the right answer. And I think that is what that ancient heritage of hate for essentially giving humanity the gift of a future.
Yes.
Is what really is driving what we see every day in the media, and unfortunately the hate behind what we are now seeing in the war in Gaza.
And all of us see it.
Yes.
All of us see it. It's particularly intense in Israel because they're being attacked every day. A friend of mine, his little town was aimed at, but fortunately Iron Dome works, but this little town was aimed at by a Hezbollah rocket today when I shot it down, thank goodness. That's what they're going through every day,
Right.
all over Israel, not just in the south, not just in the north, but central Israel too. They get rockets all the time. Wow. I mean, we're lucky. You and I are very fortunate to live in a country where at least you don't have rockets coming at us from, let's say, Navarre. Okay. But, well, you know, I love my friends and I hate that they're being attacked. But yeah, I don't think that we can depend on what we read in the media. I really don't. I look at the BBC, for example. I used to respect the BBC. When I was a kid, I listened to it on the radio, BBC International. I thought, I want to listen to them. It's really cool. British talking to me. Not anymore. Not after the stuff I've seen, especially in the last month and a half.
Yes.
What a bunch of liars. I mean, just blatant lying about what's going on. No sense of objectivity at all. And how do I explain that? Back to your question. Why is Israel so unsuccessful at countering all the anti-Semitism? Because the world hates people who want to obey God and do good things. That's true. I'm trying to think of something that I read not too long ago, that it was in Pirkei Avot, so wisdom of the sages. I think 2,000 years ago, something like that.
Mhm.
What do we want from Judaism, and what do we want from a fellow Jew? Do good, loving kindness, have a sense of shame that you're responsible for what you do, and always look forward to serving God with whatever you do. And I think those are three things that any person would be a better person for doing. But to me, that's what it means to be a Jew. And I think that's where I have to look at Israel and what they're doing. One, they tell the truth, and two, they're, to get back to our discussion about humanitarian behavior in war. It's part of who they are. We should learn from them. I hope our Marine Corps general comes back and reports to the Pentagon, said, we learned a lot. This is how you do it. Anyway, you know what I think.
General, I want to thank you for another engrossing and informative discussion, and I hope our viewers and readers will take heed of some of the interesting remarks. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jerry, my good friend. I appreciate your investment in this process of telling the truth and keeping our listeners informed about the issues that are on their hearts. Thank you.
Thank you.